the heating and ventilation system of the building. But that was sort of worked through in conjunction with us talking to E-Cubed about how we're going to deal with these energy consumption parts of the brief, and what might be a sensible way of heating and cooling the various parts of the building. So it's very much what you sort of might call a mixed mode, in the sense that the library is treated differently from the community centre, which is treated differently from the meeting rooms, which is treated differently from the ancillary circulation spaces, all with the idea of targeting that energy consumption, and also providing an environment which is suitable for the particular use and its frequency. So that was kind of all worked through. Equally with structure, similarly, we worked through the process of talking about how we might construct, again, the community centre, the library, what we wanted to achieve in terms of openness and closure, in terms of number of windows. Obviously, we always had an idea that we wanted to engage with the park and the library to make that connection and make that as glazed as possible. But then what you're looking at as well, you say, well, I don't want any structure, so how do I introduce structure? But also I've got a lot of glass facing north, so how do I deal with heat gain? So all those sorts of things are kind of managed as part of the design process. Similarly with the community centre, it's like, well, it's a trade between, well, if we're going to play ball sports in there, they tend to damage things like windows, so how do we deal with that, or what do we make the community centre out of? So it's robust for those sorts of activities, but equally still feels like you want to inhabit the space for other activities which are not, shall we say, active recreation.
Okay. How did the estimation cost compare with the actual budget after consulting with different builders, etc.?
So in terms of that, so council did engage their own quantity survey.
Okay.
So they were providing budget checks at the various stages. And I think generally it was sort of tracking okay, but the budget for the project was increased at some point because of those issues I mentioned earlier, which is it was realised that despite what they were trying to do, the budget wasn't quite sufficient to construct the building that met the brief without it being excessive. So that was adjusted, and then of course during the tender process, that's when builders were engaged to provide a price, and again there was a process to go through in terms of seeing what their prices were and the like.
Okay. Does that mean that the council was sort of clearly watching over the whole project, throughout the whole phase of the project? Okay, I see. How were the construction contractors chosen? So you said by the council, right? So they only had a set team going on?
So council have their own sort of procurement team.
Okay.
And again, because they're dealing with public money, that needs to be transparent and fair and equitable. So there's a number of processes they could have gone through. I think at that point, what I haven't said is the project kind of went on hold for about a year while effectively that's what happened. It didn't. They never sort of said it's on hold. But what happened is in the transition from Waitakere through to Auckland, what happened is the project management team who looked after all the property at Auckland were just effectively swamped by all these projects coming under their one umbrella. So it took them a long time to sort of work through, I guess, priorities, assigning staff and the like. So by the time it came to tender, from their point of view, they were kind of behind. And so what they did in terms of the contract was a one-stage process. Normally I think they would have gone through a two-stage process, but they went through a one-stage process, which was each contractor was did they have a shortlist? I can't remember. What they did was each contractor that priced the job had effectively two envelopes. One envelope was around the capability, and their personnel and their team and their construction methodology and what they could offer to the project. And the other envelope was their price. And so it's what called a weighted attributes. So each of the attributes, including price, has a weight, which anybody can vary in terms of what weight it has. And so then you effectively end up scoring each of those attributes, giving them a mark, if you like. The price will get its own mark, depending on whether it's the lowest, the middle, and so on. And then all the scores are combined, and then you kind of, through that process, select the preferred tenderer. So it's not necessarily the lowest price that will win, because it might be the second lowest price because they've actually got the best team, the best capability. So they might have scored well in those categories, and that's effectively what happened.
Was there any issues with design expectations from the client, and how were they resolved?
Any issues?
Yeah. So when you propose a certain, let's say like a design feature,
Yeah.
was there any disagreements between the council? Them saying, hey, maybe we should do it this way, etc.
Not really. I think generally the council as a client are reasonably experienced in building projects, and whereas say in a residential project you might get a client who's never built anything.
Okay.
So that's quite a different scenario. I'm not saying one's better, one's worse. It's just quite different. I think I guess the couple of challenges that we did have was one, the library has doors that open to the outside. There's about 4 sets of doors that open directly onto the deck and then onto the park.
Okay.
Most libraries have one point of entry and exit, which is around book security. So of course if you've got these open doors, there's no security. That was a challenging thing to get through. It seemed to us that it was just made common sense that you'd want to be in the library, walk out onto the deck and engage with the park, and kind of vice versa. So that was a challenge. I wouldn't say everybody thought that was a good idea. The other challenge was, I'm not saying it's true or not, but when the project was initially briefed, it was determined that the community centre would provide a space for active recreation, basketball, netball, indoor sports and things. And part of that was around the local community had a proportion of youth that were looking for something to do. And if they didn't find anything, perhaps they might just cause trouble. So that was sort of kind of the council's view about one way of dealing with that is you provide facilities and the like to provide an outlet. But of course, the community changes, and there was a consultation process with the community, with the business centre, through a series of public meetings where there's an opportunity for the community to engage with the design as it progressed. And what happened there was there were a lot more representatives of younger families who were looking for a different type of community centre. They were looking for a drop-in centre or a place for young parents to mix and mingle, a place for sort of more passive activity to take place. Not to say it couldn't happen, but they didn't want I'm not saying we did, but they didn't want a basketball court with no windows. That's not their idea of a community centre. Yeah. That sort of needed to be managed and dealt with as well.
Were there any positive or negative effects on the design, on the environment, like the building on the environment?
I'm not quite sure of your question. I guess you could have a view about demolishing an existing facility to build a new facility which is 50% bigger than the old facility. I guess that's one thing you could consider in terms of being a negative. It seems kind of strange. I guess the counter to that is that, and then of course what happens is the community loses that facility for 12 months, which is more of a problem. I guess the upside of that is, of course, they again get this brand new facility and they get an increase in patronage in terms of people who are using the library, using the community facilities, engaging with it. So that's sort of kind of the eventual positive outcome. I guess the other thing is that I don't know if we have any documentation, but essentially from our point of view, rightly or wrongly, the park is here to the north. The library engages with the park because it seemed to us to be that's the part of the design that you want to engage with the park. The community facility or the big hall is put on the southern side that acts as a buffer. It was always going to be the bigger building because of its volume that it was required for basketball and netball, and so we sort of kind of put it there where it has the least impact in terms of the surrounding, and also separates the library and the community centre acoustically. If you looked at the old facility, the library was on the south side. It was completely overshadowed by the community centre on the northern boundary, so it tended to be a little dark and enclosed. And the community centre was a blank, brick building with very little windows, and so there's very little engagement for the public. When you walk past it, you could hardly see what was happening. It had very little engagement with the public or with the community, or that sort of sense of visibility. If you can see something happening, you think, I might go and do that. Because if you can't, it's more difficult to engage or feel invited.
Yeah, for sure. Were there any environmental constraints that affected the project, obviously, other than the soil that you didn't expect?
Environmental constraints? No.
No?
Well, aside from the ones I've talked about, location in terms of, while the site was extensive, it made sense as to put it where it is.
Cool. Did you or do you know if the council needed to offer mitigation to any of the neighbouring buildings?
Yeah. So what happened during the planning process is that, as I said, the building's non-compliant. It's over height, it's over site coverage, it's too big. You're not allowed to build in a park. And through our own analysis, we thought the site was quite restrictive. So what happened in the planning process was it was determined it needed to go through, what do they call it? I think it's a limited notification process. So people were given the opportunity to make submissions in terms of whether they supported or didn't support the design. Effectively the neighbouring properties. The neighbouring properties were the supermarket to the south, and then there was another building which is on Te Atatu Road in the sort of the south west corner, which was effectively once upon a time the old post office. So there used to be the post office, the community centre and the library, and they're all built at the same time. For whatever reason, the old post office was sold into private ownership. Right. So the occupant of that felt that this new building on their northern boundary was completely going to overshadow them, and so we went to a hearing for that. Because we knew we were going to a hearing, what we ended up doing was redesigning the project, and so what happened, amongst other things, is effectively there's now a kind of a lane that connects Te Atatu Road with the car park, running along the back edge of the community centre, between the community centre and the existing old post office and supermarket. So that moved that building away from overshadowing them. So effectively that was a concession that council made in the sense that it alleviated some of the concerns that the objectors had. And that proved to be the case. But I guess the cost for council was one, engaging us to do some additional work, which we were paid for, and two, that we went to a hearing which had a cost in terms of, again, some of the consultants needed to do some additional work for that hearing, plus council needed to engage a planning lawyer to effectively present the project at the hearing.
Right.
Yeah. So there were some additional costs for the project because of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you have would you happen to know estimate of how much extra cost that would be?
It'll be somewhere because, actually, having said that, I would only know our additional fees. I wouldn't know the
Right.
the other consultants' fees that were engaged directly by council.
Okay. Cool. And what information did you need to provide in the assessment of environmental
Effects.
Yeah.
So for us, because we had a planner engaged, they took care of all that.
Right,
They sort of
right.
wrote all that. All we needed to provide was effectively is our drawings and documentation and a design statement.
Okay, cool. And just in terms of that resource consent,
Yeah.
what documents were you guys required to give in that report?
For us as architects, plan, section, elevations. I think we had some sort of 3D visual documentation. We would have had some calculations around areas in terms of site coverage and the like.
Yeah.
And then the other consultants, there would have been, obviously there's the planner who was engaged, but then as I mentioned before, there would have been an acoustic report, there would have been a traffic report in terms of supporting the application,
Yeah.
and then there probably would have been some geotech and civil information, and also landscape, because landscape was part of us. So landscape's a bit funny in the sense that, well, on one hand there wasn't much because our building occupied most of the available site, but there was still a zone of landscape around the periphery of the building, and effectively the car park became part of that landscape project as well.
Cool. And how has the project team changed during this phase of the design?
Do you mean our team?
Yes, your team.
We tend not to. We try to, not always successful, but we try to keep, I guess, the same people working on the project right the way through. You know, we don't say, oh, you're the design team and you're the visualization team and you're the documentation team. We sort of broadly keep the same people working all the way through.
Yeah.
What we do have at some stages, we do have somebody in our own team that tends to specialise in the written specification for the project. But we do have changes. Sarah, who I mentioned, who was involved in the project, she went on parental leave partway through.
Yeah.
And during that time she was on parental leave, she resigned.
Oh.
So she never came back. So then we employed Alicia, who I mentioned, and she took over that role and completed the project. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But has she not taken the leave or resigned? She would have been to stay on the team.
Yeah, she would have kept going with the project if she wasn't pregnant.
I'm just curious, was there any other side projects going on while you were doing this?
Any other what?
Any other side
Project?
Yeah, projects.
Or was this the only one that you're working on? At
Oh
the time?
no. I guess in terms of a director role, you're probably working on quite a few projects at any one time. Yeah, but not full time, obviously.
Right.
Whereas, say, some of the personnel might be more involved in that project, full time.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay. And just in terms of zoning, was the proposal listed under permitted, controlled, or discretionary under the unitary plan?
Discretionary.
Discretionary. And were there any parts of the design that changed, or were there any restrictions due to the unitary plan?
Well, I think the only change was the one I outlined, where we realised that through the submission process there were some issues that needed to be addressed, and I think we collectively decided the best way to address them is to modify the design before we got to the hearing.
Yeah.
So, people made their submissions on the original design,
Yeah.
then we modified that design, and that's what we submitted at the hearing
Right.
in terms of a way of improving the project and addressing the concerns that the neighbours had.
Mm.
So, that was the key change there.
Cool. And what were the rules that applied to the zone that the building was under?
The rules.
Yeah, very specific.
So this was pre-unitary plan. So
Right.
this was either, as I said, it started under Waitakere City Council's
Right,
district plan, and then transitioned across to Auckland, which is effectively picking up the same thing at the time. So the unitary plan is effectively the answer of dealing with 5 different councils merged into one.
Mm.
I think the key is that as I said, it was a park, and there were some pretty strong limitations in terms of what sort of building you can put in the park.
Yeah.
So even though there was an existing one there which was non-compliant,
Mm.
effectively it was considered that the new building was still non-compliant, even though there was a precedent for a non-compliant activity already on the site.
Yeah, yeah. And did you have to consult with the mana whenua, and did they have any views on the project that you guys were designing?
Yeah, I was trying to remember. We did, and it was a very unusual experience in that I'm just trying to recall because it was a while ago.
Yeah.
But yeah, we did with this project. I mean, you do on any council project, and we went and made we visited and made a presentation to them, and for some reason, I don't know why, but their offices were out by the airport somewhere, and I have no idea why. And yeah, we sort of made the presentation, and they sort of said thanks, and they weren't that interested.
Right.
I don't know. I'm not quite sure why. But so that's one thing. I guess the other thing, of course, is that again with council projects, is that all information is bilingual. So there was another process to go through in terms of making sure, effectively through signage, that everything was correct in terms of consultation with whenua there.
Yeah, yeah. And how was the project publicly notified?
That I'm not sure, because we didn't do that.
Right, was it the council?
The council
too?
did that, but I mean normally, so on one hand, it was notified through, actually effectively approaching each of the neighbouring properties.
Right.
And that's normally done through post.
Yeah.
In terms of notification, and that can be not only the property owner but the property occupier. So if the property's tenanted, equally, they have an opportunity as much as the property owner does.
Yeah.
So, for example, the supermarket, I think from memory, is run by one of the chains. I can't remember which one it is. It's Countdown, I think, isn't it? I'm not sure. But the actual building is owned by a property owner.
Yeah.
So you've got two parties there.
Right.
So you might say on one hand, well, the tenant, they're here today, gone tomorrow, but a supermarket tenant's not. So, they have equal weight, they have equal value. So yeah, that's the way that these people were notified. Otherwise, if it's a public notification, they usually advertise it. You find it in the public notices and the paper. If that's not an obsolete way of doing it.
Cool. What about just like the general public? Did they have any opposing opinions?
Yeah.
That had affected the project at all?
Well, so as I said, we went through, and council required us to go through a public consultation process. So, we engaged with the local business community. I can't remember what they're called, the business association, whatever they are. That was one thing. But equally, we attended a couple of public meetings that were held in the evening in the old community centre, where anybody could attend. And of course, you don't get the whole community attending, but through that process they have an opportunity to air their views, and they are recorded and taken note of. And as I said, that's where, for example, we've got a lot of young family representation, and their views about what a community centre should be. So some changes were made around that. But equally, you get people coming along who want to know why council is demolishing a building and spending $10 million.
Right. Yeah.
So it's got nothing to do with the design of the project. It's more about the whole intent of the project. So that happens as well.
Right.
So often public consultation is not about the design, it's about issues around the project as a whole, which, as an architect you've got little control over as to the decision-making process of whether it's a good idea to spend $10 million and demolish a building.
Yeah.
But you'll always get those sorts of views, yeah.
Does the council consultants come with you to these public meetings?
Well, they'd lead it, yeah. It's their project. Often the architect is there as the consultant to present the design and answer any queries or questions around the design. But it's really about public consultation for the project in the widest sense. We are providing you with a new community centre and library, and here it is, and we'd like to get your feedback on any aspect of that. For example, there were, in terms of the brief, the original brief we had kind of had two sections. One was must have and nice to have. So what happened was all the nice to haves got cut because of cost.
Right.
So they needed to build a building for a certain budget, and one way to make a project cheaper is to make it smaller. So when we started the project, they had an idea about incorporating Plunket in terms of that as you kind of say a third-party facility within the building, because there were some Plunket rooms around the corner, and they thought it'd be good to include that in the community facilities, which would have been good. They had an idea about having a gym in the building, which again would have been a third-party operator. The council don't run gyms, but they could have a third party. They also had an idea about having kind of a cafe or coffee service, if you like, within the library space. So coffee and books and whatever. So they were some of the nice to haves, but yeah, they all got chopped.
So at what part of the project did you send out your the resource consent?
So resource consent is normally at the end of preliminary design. So you sort of kind of know what the building looks like, what the envelope is, how big it is. You've done a bit of a budget check. You kind of know what it's made from, how it's built, but it's still preliminary.
Yeah. And also, what was just like the overall cost of hiring your team of consultants?
I need to look that up.
Okay.
I can give that to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. And now just moving to the preliminary documents. What sort of documents did you have to provide? For the preliminary document set.
For preliminary design,
Yeah.
same as the resource consent, which I think we covered. Yep.
Yeah. And what were the preliminary document cost estimates?
You mean for the project?
Yeah, for
Yeah.
the project.
Yeah, that was done. I can't tell you off the top of my head what it was,
Yeah.
but we did have a estimate done at preliminary design.
Right. And who was responsible for calculating kind of the overall
Cost? Quantity survey. As I said, they were engaged directly by council.
Yeah.
So
okay.
the reason for they do that is they want the quantity surveyor to be independent from the consultant team.
Right.
You know, so if I employed them, I could potentially manipulate them. You know.
Okay. Right.
You don't, but you could. You know. So they want them to be an independent cost advisor to the client, so they employ them directly.
Right. Okay. Cool. And just with the whole going over budget, what was sort of the reasons why the project went over? The budget? Any unforeseen costs?
No. I mean, I guess the issue was, you know, as I said, they had a whole lot of must-haves in the budget, and I guess they made the project cost more than they could afford, so you know they were trimmed. So that was established fairly early on. I think the other issue with the budget was, as I said, you know, it was established a number of years before they actually got to the stage of knowing, you know, what the design outcome was.
Yeah.
So, you know, while our design answered the brief in terms of, you know, particularly area, because I guess that's the other thing you need to look at. You know, if somebody's saying we need a series of meeting rooms that add up to 100 square metres, and you design a series of meeting rooms that add up to 120, you know, the client could conceivably say, well, we're having to build 20 square metres more of space we didn't ask for, and that will have a cost. Now, you might have done that for other reasons, you know, like it works really well, or it's a good space, or, you know, those sorts of things. But you know, at some point, particularly with those sorts of projects, you know, you do need to be mindful of those things if they are adding cost over and above the budget. I learned that doing New Lynn Library. You know, we designed a building.
Yeah.
It ended up being too expensive. Council said how big it is the building, and you know, we realised it was over what the brief asked for. And so, you know, the first thing council said is, well, you need to make it smaller, you know, to meet the brief.
Yeah.
That's what we did.
Okay. Cool. How often would you meet with the client or clients, city council, and what was sort of discussed during your meetings with them?
So I think, you know, probably from memory again, it was probably in those early phases, it was probably weekly, maybe fortnightly. You know, generally, again, because it is a council project, you know, those meetings are minuted and documented. And it's really broadly, you know, an update of where the project's got to.
Yeah.
There will be within that program a series of milestones in terms of, you know, preliminary design, developed design, and usually at that stage there's a report submitted to council, and that is circulated within their team, and they all, in their own respective ways, sign it off, you know, to make sure, you know, we are dealing with those issues around the brief, you know, whether it be sustainability, art, energy consumption, maintenance, parks, or, you know, user library activity, community centre, and the like. And then there may or may not be, you know, a presentation at some point to council, you know, themselves, in terms of saying, well, this is where the project's got to. That didn't really happen with Auckland Council, but it did happen with Waitakere.
Right. Cool. And what was the length of time between submitting the preliminary document set and the developed document set?
Well, quite a while, because they didn't do anything for a year.
Right.
So yeah, a lot longer than anybody would have liked.
Right.
It shouldn't have been that long, but yeah, as I said, it was circumstances beyond our control.
Yeah. And what were the changes between the preliminary and the developed documents?
Well, I guess key design changes that we've outlined in terms of that sort of resource consent negotiation. Other changes, nothing really, apart from what you'd expect in terms of development. You know, you are refining everything just to that next level of detail and degree.
Yeah. Cool. And what sort of documents did you have to prepare for the developed documents there? Was it quite similar to the preliminary?
Yes, although just more extensive.
Right.
I think at preliminary design we would have had what we would have called an outline specification. As we move through into the project, that becomes more of a developed written specification document. You know, while at preliminary design we would have had plan and section elevation and the like, and again at developed and moving on to detail, you know, just more development in terms of all the consultants, how they all are integrated into the one project, and I guess much more certainty around what all those components might be.
What part of the design process did you check if the building complied with the building code?
I guess particularly that tends to occur more in detailed design, because that's when you are engaging with particularly issues around E2, waterproofing, H1 insulation. But you know, you're also mindful that in early design stages, it's a public building, so therefore its requirements around accessibility need to be complied with. So if you designed a building where you can't get a ramp into it because it's, you know, not a level surface, or corridor widths aren't wide enough, you know, you should have determined that at, you know, preliminary design. At various phases they, you know, begin to come in, but the more you move through the project, the more you need to be aware of that compliance. You know, stairs are accessible, corridor widths are the right way. You know, you've dealt with ventilation requirements in terms of fresh air and how you're going to deal with that. You know, ventilation or extract out of bathroom facilities. A building this size often ends up with internal rooms, so how are you going to deal with any issues around that? You know, because you can't always get a window or ventilation, or, you know, a whole range of things.
When was the final review, and what was sort of discussed during that meeting?
Final review of the design.
Of the design.
Well, I guess, as I said, you know, with council they very much have, you know, preliminary design, developed design, detailed design. The review checks at each of those. So technically the last one would have been at detailed design before we went to tender.
Right. Cool. What was the total risk for each elevation using the risk matrix? Do you remember?
No, I can't remember whether we needed to do it. We probably did actually, but I guess you know, the issue being is in terms of the combined consultant team, there's the risk matrix which we probably went through with. With the compliance around H1, that's normally carried out by the services engineer. And you know, all that means is, you know, it's a balance between what's a window, what's a wall, where's the insulation, what are we double glazing, what do we need to do to meet the requirements there. All I know is it wasn't me.
Okay, cool. And would you know anything about the H2 energy calculations?
Yes and no, in the sense that that was E-Cube's responsibility in terms of them being the service engineer, and I was aware that we needed to meet a target, and I believe that we did, meet that target in terms of consumption.
Awesome. Yeah. Were there also any warranties that came with the project?
At the end,
Yeah.
there's always a long list of warranties and guarantees. While that will be listed in our specification and in the other consultant specification where applicable or appropriate, it's up to the builder to furnish those at the end of the construction period to make sure they match what was required back in the specification. And of course, the builders had the specification as part of their tender documents, so they're aware of what they need to be achieving. So if they said, well, the windows are not going to meet a 10-year guarantee, well then they never should have installed them in the first place if they knew it was never going to meet the guarantee.
Yeah.
So it sort of kind of works.
Right. How did the final cost of the project compare to the initial budget? Like, it was over. Was it a substantial amount over?
No, I think, as I said, the client had adjusted the budget partway through. I think the other thing that was the other issue, I guess, it's about, well, where or what do you do with the notion of a contingency? So what do you do with the notion of the unforeseen items? And so, that might be an increase in budget in terms of, you could say, well, we signed a contract to build the building for X dollars and it actually ended up costing us more. Now, have you allowed for that contingency? Councils generally have somewhere, they'll have a contingency fund. Because when the builder, what I didn't say was, so we went out to tender, we got tender prices, through that process identified a preferred contractor. And then what council said to the contractor was, okay, so here's your price. We want you to go away and look at all the documentation and tell us effectively what they wanted was a guaranteed maximum price. Normally you don't arrive at that through a tender process, but they did because they needed it to be competitive. And so what the builder would do is they would look at it and identify anything they thought was at risk in the documentation which they hadn't allowed for. And so generally the price would increase slightly to take care of that risk. But the builder would have still said, okay, we're assuming the risk for the unforeseen items that is not in the documentation for whatever reason. But we'll still tag out a couple of items, might be longer than a couple, but the two they did tag out was anything in the ground, meaning anything unforeseen in the ground which caused additional cost or time. They said the client needs to pay for that. Because they didn't know what it was, which proved to be the case. There was, soft ground, so the council paid for that additional, or the client paid for that additional work there. The other one they tagged out was there was an existing building on site. They tagged out anything to do with asbestos. So when you find asbestos in a building you're demolishing, there's a certain process and procedure you need to go through in terms of the demolition and removal of asbestos items, which again is more costly and expensive than putting a bulldozer through it. Because that's the cheapest way to demolish a building. So again, there was asbestos, and council needed to cover that. So that would have added additional cost.
Right.
But I think generally, within council's expectations, the building generally tracked okay. It wasn't wildly over budget.
Okay, that's good. And what documents were required for the submission of the building concept?
Well, basically, drawings and specifications from those consultants that I've outlined. Any reports. It was a pretty comprehensive set of documents. It was a couple of boxes. By the time we assembled it all, because you've got architect's drawings, you've got structural drawings, you've got services drawings, you've got 3 or 4 different types of services.
Wow.
You've got various reports, yeah, pretty extensive.
Is there questions?
Oh yes, I do.
Did you each write the questions, or were you just sharing them around, or did you write them collectively?
Yeah, we wrote different parts.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did the building require a building consent?
Yep.
Yes. Anyway, did the building code or consent restrict the building in terms of design?
No, not really.
Did the council require additional information to be provided? And if so, what was the reason?
The building consent.
Yes.
Yeah. Usually, yeah. I mean, we find that's always the case, that you submit the drawings documentation, and without fail, there's usually a list of queries or clarifications that council require, additional information that you haven't provided. But equally, sometimes they just can't read the drawing. So it's a combination of everything, really. Yeah.
Okay.
And that can happen more than once during that building consent process.
Okay.
Yeah.
Were there any parts of the building that you weren't sure would pass a consent but did, or vice versa?
No, I think generally we were confident we were going to get a building consent.
Did the building get the building consent on the first try?
Well, I think once we had addressed all the queries and answered all their requirements, yes, yeah, it did. It wasn't rejected. Yeah.
Did you need to make a change to design after receiving the building consent?
No, I don't think we did.
And what was the time frame for applying for the consent and receiving it?
Too long. It's meant to be 20 working days, 4 weeks a month. The thing that happens is that, excuse me, when council issue a query, the clock stops. So, if it takes you 10 days to respond to that query, it's not adding to their 20 days, but it's adding to the length of time. But equally, councils get really busy. They don't take 20 working days, they take 40 working days, and it ends up being much longer than you would have anticipated, which happened in this particular case. Yeah.
Were you expecting that when you
Well, put it this way, it wasn't surprising. I mean, yeah, ideally you want to lodge 20 working days, you get a consent, but it never happens.
And did that really affect any part of the process? Or?
No, I don't think it prevented the project from starting on site.
Okay.
So I guess from when you lodge consent to when you receive it, you obviously you're not meant to start working on site until you've got a building consent in place. But equally, during that time, you're also going through a tender process. The client's engaging with the contractor and the building contract, and so the two processes tend to work in parallel.
Were there conditions that came with the consent?
Yep.
So I guess those would be queries or.
Well, no. Often when a consent is issued, there are conditions.
Okay.
So some of those conditions relate to. So when you get a resource consent, you get conditions, and when you get a building consent, you get conditions. And so in either or both, they'll relate to things like. A lot of them fall on the contractor to carry out. The contractor has to submit a traffic management plan in terms of how they're going to operate on site, what the vehicle movements are, where they're going to have vehicle crossings, because where they want to access the site might not necessarily be where the driveway is. What they're going to do, because they're building to the edge of the site on the street, how they're going to manage that, because they're going to have to, as you see around, when they start to block off the pavement, that all has to be agreed. They will have hours of operation, so a builder can't start on site before 7:30 in the morning. They can't build in the weekend unless they've got permission to do so. There are hours of operation. There's silt runoff, because obviously you're excavating dirt, what have you. You can't go around blocking up all the drains. It's a whole series of things they need to do with that. And then there's also conditions about, things need to be inspected at certain times during that building project. And if you don't have the inspection done and signed off, you're not meant to proceed to the next stage, because often that work would get covered up. So it's that. And then you also have what they call producer statements. So, at the end of the job, the various consultants or contractors need to submit producer statements saying it has been built according to the documentation. So what that means is, particularly around, say, structure and services. So, the structural engineer needs to inspect the site at certain points so that they can be happy the structure's been carried out correctly, so they in turn can write the producer statement at the end of the job. And if the contractor hasn't allowed them to do that, then that becomes a problem. Meaning if they've put the structure up and covered it up with cladding and the structural engineer can't see the structure, that's a problem. I mean, it doesn't happen, but
Were there any additional requirements apart from the ones you've already specified? So, with the time frame for applying for consent and receiving it, do you remember roughly how many times of 20 days it probably took?
I don't know. I seem to recall a figure about 5 months instead of a month.
Does that become worse after the amalgamation of all the councils, longer?
No, it's generally a reflection on how much activity there is. Yeah, so when it's busy, there are lots of consents, lots of applications, lots of things to be processing, but also councils aren't necessarily expanding to take care of that. Also, I think more recently, what's also happened is that councils are generally requiring more information rather than less, kind of as an outcome of the whole issue around leaky buildings, where councils, amongst other things, have been sued, and so they want to make sure and verify for themselves that what's been consented, what's been documented, what's been built is indeed correct, because otherwise they'll end up being sued for it at some point, because they're often the last entity still around. They don't disappear. Councils don't go bankrupt and close up shop and close the company down and bugger off. Whereas developers might, or builders might go into liquidation, or architects might disappear, or councils don't. Yeah.
Did you have a lot of conflict with the council during this
Consent process?
Yeah.
No more than usual. I mean, meaning, sometimes you think their requests for information are, more than they need, but equally, if you don't respond, you're not going to get a consent. So,
for the procurement, did a collaborative contract already exist, or did you have to initiate a new one?
No, council used, I think, NZS 3910, which is already an established contract. They have their own special conditions, which might change clauses in that contract, but that document is issued with the tender document, so the contractor is aware of what the contract is. So what you can't do is I don't think what you can't do is get a builder to price a job and not tell them what sort of contract they're going to enter into, because there might be issues in the contract that cause cost. For example, so in what's often in typical building contracts is retentions. So every month the builder will claim for money to be paid for the work they've done to date, and then through a process the principal or the client is obliged to pay those monies. But generally most contracts have a retention, which is to say, well, I'll pay you the money you've claimed, but I'm going to withhold 10% until the end of the contract. There's various reasons as to why you do that. But of course that will have a cost to the contractor, meaning what they know is through the course of the project they are not going to be receiving somewhere up to, depending on the value of the contract, up to 10% of the cost they're entitled to. So they need to figure out how to manage that. Do they need to borrow it, or does it mean that they don't have that money, so they need to cover that in some way? That'll have a cost. And there are a number of things within the contract that they will need to be aware of. So it's just fair and reasonable that everybody's aware of what the contract that you're entering into is, because it's not ever going to be just a verbal contract.
Sorry, just a side question. So if you said the council provided you with the contract.
Well, they nominated the contract they wanted to use, which was NZS 3910, and they also had their own special conditions. Yeah.
But if you were doing something that wasn't done by the council, so it was more of a private one,
Mm-hmm.
would you provide the contract?
Well, in the sense you can nominate it, advise, but bearing in mind that the contract is between the builder and the client. It's between the principal and the contractor. You as the architect have got no party to that contract. Builder's saying to client, I'm going to build this building based on this documentation for X number of dollars, and that's where the contract lies. So you can make suggestions as to what contract you use, but equally you could get a client saying, okay, so you tell me you're going to build it for $1 million, and okay, go. You can have a verbal contract. It's just not a particularly good idea. So yeah, we could recommend that. We could recommend the New Zealand Institute of Architects contract. They've got a series of contracts that we can suggest client and principal use. There's 3910. There's also the other one, which I can't remember what it's called, but the two main ones we come across are either Institute Architects or 3910.
So the question I've got here is, how was a tendering process and contract type established? But I guess you covered all of it in the question before. Do you have anything to add?
I think I talked about it earlier with the tender process, and with the contract they've used,
And did you have a budget
for
the procurement contract? I don't actually know how it works. Okay, let's just skip that question.
sure.
Did you choose a construction company to carry out your project, or did that come from the council?
So the council, as I said, ran a procurement process, which was not a two-stage process, but a two-envelope process, which I outlined before. So effectively, they chose the contractor through their process and how they had set up the weighted attributes. But of course, to evaluate the weighted attributes, they need a panel of people to score the weighted attributes, aside from price. Price sorts itself out. You've got the lowest that gets whatever that figure is, and you've got the highest which gets the worst figure, or the other way around. In terms of the other attributes, they had a panel which I was part of. So on that panel was the client's project manager, myself as the architect and the lead consultant. There was the procurement officer from the council, and I don't know if the QS was involved, and I think there was another council representative. So we each individually scored the attributes, and those scores were combined, and that sort of helped form the final score. So I was involved in the process, but I didn't make the decision.
Was the community involved in this process?
Selecting the contractor?
Yeah.
No.
Were there any issues in relation to contractors abiding by the contracts?
No, I mean the contractor they got was reasonably well known and reputable, and they're still here and around. They haven't gone bust.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was it?
Hawkins.
Oh, Hawkins, okay. I'm gonna have to leave. I'm gonna say a word, but
You have to leave.
yeah,
Oh.
but mine's about contract administration.
Yep.
So what forms of insurances, provisional sums, or other special conditions were put in place in forming the contracts in relation to this project?
So I've talked about special conditions. That would have been outlined by the client. In terms of insurances, so the contractor would have provided contract works insurance to cover the project during construction. That only lasts up until practical completion, when then it's the principal's role to insure the works after that date. There would have been public liability insurance in place. There would have been motor vehicle and plant insurance in place by the contractor. In terms of provisional sums, yep, there were some. I can't remember what they were, but there'll be a list of them somewhere as to what they would have covered.
That's most of it. But what retention offers were made to contractors?
Retentions.
Yeah.
There's a scale which I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's a scale of retentions in NZS 3910 where it's something like 10% of the claim up to the value of 200,000, and then it's a reducing scale, and there's usually a cap, meaning the total amount of retentions doesn't go on ad infinitum. It'll eventually be capped at some point as to a maximum retention regardless of the value of the project.
Right.
Yeah, so that was in place, and as I said, the contractor was aware of that when they were tendering for the project.
I think you might have to continue on the
No
press
problem,
because
no
I'm pretty sure.
problem.
We got you or something to say thank you.
Oh, you're doing that ahead of schedule, are you?
Sorry. It was in my bag, so.
Thank you. All right.
So. Alrighty. We'll
Sorry,
continue.
See you, Daniel.
Yeah.
See ya.
Need to calm down. Look at the Christmas one.
Discrepancies. Were there any discrepancies between the E2AS1 and also the building code and the contract documentation?
Discrepancies between what?
The E2AS1
Yeah. Between that and what?
and the
Building
building code
code
and
and
the
the-
contract documentation.
And theoretically, no, but I can't remember.
Okay.
There shouldn't have been.
What testing or checking was done to check the quality of construction was of an acceptable standard?
So in some ways, each consultant, as I outlined before, was responsible for being on site at the appropriate times to check their work, particularly if they were going to be required to provide a producer statement.
Okay.
I think where we ended up was there was a fortnightly site meeting, which was us, the client, and the contractor, plus any relevant consultant, because that would have changed over time. And then we also initiated a weekly meeting on the alternative weeks, which was more, slightly more informal in terms of addressing and dealing with any issues as they arose through the construction process. So we weren't necessarily required to do that, but I could see that just in terms of a project of that size, that was a good idea, just so everybody kept on top of everything, and there was sort of no any potential for disagreement or dispute was sort of dealt with quickly and timely, and so never eventuated, which proved to be the case.
What provisions did you make under the Health and Site Safety Act and the realizing of the project?
Excuse me. So there are some of those issues dealt with at design. So buildings need to be maintained, and so you need to have provided and I won't say design, but provided systems to enable safe access. Particularly around the roof. So there's a access ladder up to the roof. There's a fall restraint system up on the roof. There's a series of walkways so you can access the plant safely, because they often need to be maintained, filters changed and the like. So that's all in the middle of the building. The series of walkways and platforms, so it's safe. In terms of accessing the other roofs, particularly around cleaning and maintenance, there's a fall restraint system in place, which is usually one of the clip and climb type things where you can access the roof, clip on with a harness, and then you can move around that roof in a relatively safe manner. So that's very much dealt with as a design, but equally you need to have probably a system in place about something as simple as how you're going to clean the windows. So they're also kind of design items. In terms of and so that design, but also post completion issues. In terms of during construction, there are obviously some obligations as the architect in terms of you and your staff being on site. So there's some things we need to manage around that. Health and safety is always an agenda item at any meeting, site meeting. And there are a number of different types of meetings that we have during construction with a project like that. So, as I said, we had fortnightly site meetings, and then we had the weekly sort of site catch-up. But then they have what they call a project control group meeting, which is once a month, which is a meeting with the client in the wider sense, the consultant team if needed, ourselves as the lead consultant, and the contractor. We talk about broader issues in terms of program, the financial side of things, and the like as well. But yeah, you need to be aware of health and safety at many levels.
Okay. Did you schedule site visits coincide with council inspections?
No.
Okay.
No, they're arranged separately by the contractor.
Okay, gotcha. Were you required to amend any issues to align with the building code?
I think there are always certain minor things that come up during construction where you need to review details or make some changes, which I think did happen in a few minor incidences.
Okay.
But also, the builder or a good builder is aware of their, shall we say, liability issues, and they want to make sure things are built properly. So equally, they might have suggestions around how certain things might be constructed, built, what have you, because they can see some issues that perhaps you hadn't thought about.
How are the CCC observations conducted?
The what?
The CCC.
Code of compliance
Yep.
certificate?
Yep.
So the onus was on the builder,
Okay.
the contractor, to provide that. So they went through that process of carrying that out. I think because it's a public building and quite often the code of compliance can take some time, I think in this case there would have been an application for a certificate of public use, which enables you to inhabit a building from the public's point of view before you've got a code of compliance. Because you can't theoretically occupy a public building without one or the other. And of course a CPU is easier to obtain.
The last part is
I'll read that. So just with the site inspection, were there any issues within post-completion site inspection, and was there a defects report done?
There was a defects report done. I mean, I think at practical completion, which essentially is the time when the project is handed over from the contractor to the client, and theoretically, notwithstanding those issues around CPUs and CCCs, it's when the client can occupy the building. But after that point, there are still things which you agree are either deferred works or are minor defects which need to be carried out within a certain time frame of the defects liability period to the client's satisfaction. And there's often a list and a schedule. And so one of the things you do is you work through that list in terms of you issue the list to the contractor, they carry out the works, they said they've been completed, you inspect them, are they actually done or not, what have you, or have there been new issues emerge, which often do during that period when a building starts to settle down. In terms of, so that's the defects. In terms of post-contract work, I think we did have one issue around